The house on Old Briar Road stood apart from the world, its windows dark even at noon, its walls bowed with the weight of seasons and secrets. People in town spoke of it only when necessary, and never in full sentences, as if the place itself might overhear. 4 years, only one thing was certain: nothing good ever came out of that house, and nothing living ever seemed eager to come out at all. On a frigid autumn evening, when the sun fell early and the air tasted of iron, a faint sound drifted from the shuttered upper floor. It was too soft to be a scream, too strangled to be a call for help, but enough to make a passerby pause at the edge of the property. The sound didn't come again, yet it hung in the air like a memory that refused to settle. Behind those sealed windows was Mara, a girl the town once knew, now kept out of sight for so long that even her face had faded from their collective memory. The world she lived in had been carefully constructed, rules whispered through locked doors, rituals performed in dim hallways, punishments delivered in silence. Her father's voice echoed like scripture in her mind, teaching her that beyond the walls lay chaos and danger, that only inside this house could she be safe. Her brothers reinforced every lie, their watchful eyes turning each room into a boundary she dared not cross. For years, Mara believed what they told her. She believed because she had no choice. But belief begins to rot when fear becomes unbearable, and in the quiet moments between footsteps, Mara felt something rising inside her, a feeling she had forgotten had a name. It was small at first, a flicker rather than a flame, but enough to make her question the world they trapped her in. Enough to make her wonder what waited beyond the front door that she had not been allowed to open since she was a child. On the night the wind scraped against the siding and the farmhouse creaked like an old ship ready to split, Mara pressed her hand against the cold windowpane and imagined another life. A life with open air, open doors, and no voices telling her who she must be. She didn't know that far beyond the fields, where the road curled out of sight, someone had begun asking questions about the girl who no longer appeared on school records. Mara's disappearance began so quietly that, at first, no one realized it had happened. She had always been a shy child, the kind who lingered at the back of classrooms and walked home with her books pressed tightly to her chest, as if protecting something precious. But even the quietest children leave traces, friends who expect them to show up, teachers who notice empty seats, neighbors who see them playing in the yard. For Mara, those traces began to fade one by one until, suddenly, there were none at all. Her desk sat untouched. Her backpack never returned home. Her footsteps vanished from the dirt path leading to the farmhouse. And when the school called her father, they were given a simple explanation delivered in a tone that shut down further questions. Mara had gone to live with relatives in another state. It was spoken with such finality that the administrator on the phone hesitated, sensing the weight behind the words but unsure how to challenge them. To the neighbors, the story sounded strange. Mara had never mentioned relatives. The family rarely left the property, and their interactions with others consisted of nods, curt greetings, and closed doors. Still, in small towns people often choose the comfort of believing a lie over the discomfort of poking at something that feels wrong. So the community accepted the explanation, even if it left a sour taste, and life in Briar Hollow continued as it always had. But for one woman who lived across the field, doubt sank its roots deep. She had seen Mara just days before, walking with her head down as usual, but with something new, an anxious urgency in her steps, a stiffness in her shoulders, as though she sensed eyes on her from somewhere unseen. The woman remembered how Mara had paused at the fence line that afternoon, glancing back toward the house as if calculating a decision she didn't have the courage to make. After Mara's supposed move, the farmhouse grew even more withdrawn from the world. Curtains that once fluttered with passing breezes were nailed shut. The front porch, once cluttered with boots and pails, cleared as though no child had ever lived there. The brothers stopped attending town events entirely, and the father's truck appeared on the road only at peculiar hours, headlights off even before sunrise. The neighbors convinced themselves it was none of their business, yet anxiety clung to them whenever the wind carried the faint clatter of something metallic from the direction of the house. Some nights, dogs barked at shadows that lingered too long near the fence posts. Some mornings, children swore they saw a silhouette in the upstairs window before it dipped away. Nobody wanted to admit that the silhouette seemed small, almost the size of the girl they'd been told had gone away. The first reports about the locked upper floor began with whispers, the kind that move through small towns like drifting smoke, clinging to anyone willing to breathe them in. The farmhouse had always carried an air of secrecy, but after Mara's disappearance, it developed a stillness that made even seasoned locals uneasy. People who passed by noticed that the windows on the top floor were no longer just shuttered, they were sealed, covered from the inside with what looked like heavy boards. On certain evenings, when the wind pressed against the house with enough force, something inside would respond with a muted thud, as if a piece of furniture had toppled or someone had stumbled against a wall. At first, no one wanted to acknowledge it. Most chalked it up to the house settling, the way old wood groans under weather and time. Yet the sounds kept coming, irregular but undeniable, each one a reminder that something was alive in that place that shouldn't have been. When a new couple moved into a home down the road, they noticed things others had learned to ignore. On their first week, they heard what seemed like a faint tapping late at night, too methodical to be random. The next night, the tapping grew into a muffled rhythm, pausing after every few beats as if waiting for a response. They mentioned it casually at the general store, expecting someone to laugh and tell them the house was infested with raccoons or pigeons. But instead, an odd silence settled over the room. One of the older men gave a tight, uncomfortable smile and said the noise was nothing to worry about, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, fear, maybe, or the weariness of someone who had lived too long beside a truth he couldn't accept. Curiosity pushed the couple to observe more closely, and what they saw unsettled them further. Shadows sometimes passed behind the upstairs curtains, thin and fleeting, like someone pacing. Once, while driving home late, they spotted a dim, wavering glow behind one of the boarded windows, as if a candle were burning where no light should have been. They debated calling the authorities, but without evidence of a crime, they hesitated. Still, the feeling that the house was not as empty as the family claimed began to gnaw at them. Even the mail carrier, who had delivered letters to that road for 2 decades, admitted to hearing what sounded like a low sob carried by the wind when she dropped off their mail one stormy afternoon. By then, the entire stretch of Old Briar Road felt haunted not by spirits but by something far more human, something trapped, unheard, and desperately trying to reach the world outside the locked wing of that farmhouse. The indoctrination began long before Mara understood what was happening to her. It started with small, almost invisible shifts in her daily life, tiny restrictions that seemed harmless at first. Her father stopped allowing her to walk to school alone, insisting the world outside their property had become dangerous. Then he pulled her from school entirely, explaining that the teachers were trying to fill her mind with ideas meant to turn her against her own blood. Mara, young enough to trust the authority of adults and isolated enough to have no one to question, accepted these explanations with the quiet obedience expected of her. Yet each restriction closed off a piece of her world, leaving less space to breathe, less room to wonder, and fewer voices to counter the ones echoing inside the house. Her father's lessons took on a new tone after that. They were no longer simple instructions about chores or manners, but long speeches delivered late at night, when the house felt too still and the shadows too heavy. He spoke of loyalty, destiny, and the dangers lurking beyond their land. He portrayed outsiders as predators, insisting that only family could be trusted, that only family had her best interests at heart. Mara would sit on the floor, knees drawn close, listening to him weave these ideas like a net around her mind. At first, she resisted silently, something inside her pricking with unease. But resistance became harder as the speeches grew more frequent and her world shrank to the single hallway between her room and the kitchen. Her brothers played their part as well, though in different ways. They hovered in the corners, watching her with a mixture of authority and suspicion. They repeated their father's warnings until the words felt carved into the walls. When Mara questioned any of it, even gently, one of them would shake his head and remind her of the supposed horrors waiting outside. They described kidnappers, illnesses, and invisible threats, painting images gruesome enough to keep her awake at night. Over time, fear became a constant companion, pressing against her ribs like a weight she couldn't shake off. Her father deepened the indoctrination by removing anything that tied her to the world she had once known. Books disappeared from her shelves, letters from classmates were never delivered, and her old clothes were replaced with plain garments that made her feel like a stranger to herself. He insisted she memorize certain phrases he called truths, repeating them until they became reflex. Every day, Mara felt her thoughts bending, reshaping themselves to fit the narrow space he allowed. She began to doubt her memories, question her instincts, and feel guilty for wanting things she used to love. Bit by bit, the girl she had been dimmed, replaced by someone molded to fit her father's design, someone who flinched at the idea of freedom because she no longer knew what it meant. The shift from control to something far more sinister came in the form of a ceremony Mara never understood until it was already happening. She was 14 when her father announced that her childhood season was ending and her true purpose was beginning. His words fell with a gravity that made her stomach twist, yet no explanation followed. The house grew quieter in the days leading up to it, her brothers whispering among themselves and casting glances toward her that felt heavy with meaning she couldn't decipher. Chores she had always performed were suddenly taken away from her, as though she were being preserved for something. And the rooms were scrubbed clean in a way they never had been before, as if the house itself needed preparation for whatever her father intended. One evening, as dusk bled into the horizon and the sky turned the bruised color of old violets, Mara was summoned to the main room. She found candles arranged in a rough circle on the floor and her father standing at its center, rigid and solemn. Her brothers stood behind him, forming a barrier between her and every exit. Mara hesitated, but her father beckoned her forward with a gesture that left no space for refusal. He began to speak in a tone she had only heard during his late-night indoctrinations, measured, deliberate, and filled with absolute conviction. He told her that she was being given an honor, that she had been chosen to carry a responsibility that required unwavering obedience, that the family's survival depended on her acceptance of this role. She struggled to understand, her mind racing to grasp the meaning beneath his words. Everything felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's dream. Her father placed a frayed ribbon around her neck, something he called a binding, though it resembled nothing she had ever seen in books or on television. He spoke of unity, trust, and devotion, twisting each concept into something unrecognizable. The ribbon felt tight, not in a physical sense but in what it represented, a closing of doors she had never consented to shut. Her brothers repeated a series of phrases she had been forced to memorize over the past year, their voices merging into a droning chant that made her skin crawl. As the ceremony unfolded, Mara sensed that this was not a moment she could recover from. It marked a transformation she had no say in, a reshaping of her identity into something dictated entirely by the man who controlled every aspect of her existence. The atmosphere thickened with expectation, and although no one touched her, the pressure of their presence pressed against her like an invisible cage. By the time her father declared the ritual complete, Mara felt an invisible door slam shut inside her, sealing her into a role she never chose, one that would redefine her life in ways she could not yet comprehend. After the ritual, Mara's life shifted again, though this time the change was less ceremonial and far more suffocating. Her brothers, who had once hovered at the edges of her awareness like shadows, stepped forward into roles she could neither question nor escape. They became her constant monitors, silently enforcing rules she had been taught to obey without hesitation. Every movement she made was observed, the way she walked across the kitchen floor, the manner in which she spoke, even the slightest flicker of expression in her eyes. Mara quickly realized that missteps, however small, would not be met with gentle correction but with sharp looks, whispered admonishments, and a pressure that made her heart hammer in her chest. Fear, once abstract and distant, now wrapped around her like a heavy blanket she could not shake off. The brothers' authority was reinforced with repetition and intimidation. Mara would be reminded of the consequences of disobedience, told stories of dangers that awaited outside the property, and warned that trust was a privilege she had not earned. Their presence was constant, even in her private moments. If she lingered too long by a window, one of them would appear behind her, leaning silently in the doorway, reminding her that eyes were everywhere and judgment immediate. When she attempted to speak up, their voices merged in quiet but unyielding correction, a chorus that left no room for resistance. The lessons her father had drilled into her were now repeated in their mannerisms, their stares, their unspoken codes of authority. Mara understood quickly that defiance was impossible without inviting consequences far worse than anything she had experienced before. In addition to surveillance, the brothers manipulated her understanding of reality. They would contradict her memories, insist that events she recalled had never happened, and reinterpret situations to suggest that her judgment was flawed. Mara began to doubt herself, questioning whether she truly remembered the outside world, her own preferences, or even the way she had once understood simple truths. The subtle erosion of her autonomy was relentless. She felt herself bending under the invisible pressure, reshaping her thoughts and behaviors to meet their expectations. Every day, they reinforced the narrative that her family, her father, and by extension her brothers, were the only sources of safety and guidance. Even the physical spaces she moved through became extensions of their control. Rooms were arranged to monitor her movements, doors were left ajar strategically, and familiar objects were shifted in ways that disoriented her. Sleep became uneasy because she never knew when someone might enter unannounced. Each day, each moment, Mara felt the weight of their gaze pressing down, shaping her into the obedient figure they demanded, until her own instincts and desires were buried beneath layers of imposed compliance and perpetual fear. The first attempt to escape was born of a quiet desperation that had been building for years, a slow-burning frustration fueled by the suffocating control her family exerted over every detail of her life. Mara had learned every routine, memorized the timing of her brother's patrols, and observed the subtle patterns that governed the farmhouse. She had planned meticulously, noting which windows were slightly warped and could be pried open, which doors creaked in ways that would mask a hurried movement, and when the night was darkest enough to provide cover. It was a bitter knowledge, a skill honed not for freedom but for survival, and yet it became the foundation of her first daring attempt to flee the walls she had never truly left. On a bitter winter night, when snow lay thick across the fields and the wind rattled the siding of the farmhouse, Mara put her plan into action. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it was not fear alone, it was a mixture of exhilaration, hope, and the pure need to breathe air untainted by control. She moved silently, her boots crunching softly against the icy ground, every step measured, every sound calculated. The house behind her seemed impossibly large and impossibly alive, as if it resisted her leaving even as the world outside beckoned. For a few fleeting moments, she imagined herself free, stepping beyond the fields that had always enclosed her, touching the world she had only glimpsed in fleeting memories and whispered stories. But freedom proved elusive. Her absence was noticed almost immediately, the echoes of her escape bouncing through the house in ways she had not anticipated. Her brothers, trained in vigilance and authority, were swift and unrelenting. Within minutes, they had intercepted her along the edge of the property, their presence sudden and absolute, their words cold and unyielding. The exhilaration that had carried her vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of her failure. They did not strike her, but their hands on her arms and the tightness of their grip spoke a language far harsher than words. The punishment for her attempt was not only physical but psychological, a tightening of surveillance, a reinforcement of rules, and a subtle but unshakable reminder that escape was impossible. After that night, Mara's room was altered in ways that made the walls themselves seem to close in. Locks were reinforced, windows secured, and the furniture rearranged to limit her ability to move freely. Her brothers became even more vigilant, watching for the smallest deviation, listening for the slightest whisper of rebellion. Every day became a demonstration of control, a constant reminder that the fleeting hope of freedom could be snuffed out in moments. And though Mara remained in the house, her mind had already begun to stretch beyond its walls, imagining possibilities that seemed simultaneously terrifying and irresistible, planting the seeds of patience, observation, and courage that would one day have to serve her in ways she could not yet see. The arrival of the outsider began as a quiet disturbance in the routine Mara had known for years, almost imperceptible at first, but it carried the weight of inevitability. A new social worker had been assigned to the county, someone who approached cases with a meticulous attention to detail and an instinct for noticing inconsistencies that others overlooked. She had inherited files that, on the surface, seemed ordinary, routine check-ins, absentee records, and general reports on family well-being. Yet something about Mara's paperwork unsettled her. The records were sparse, filled with vague explanations, and punctuated by notes that didn't quite align with the standard procedures. In a town accustomed to overlooking oddities, these discrepancies stood out sharply to someone trained to question and to dig deeper. The social worker began her inquiries carefully, aware that any misstep could alert a family like Mara's. She started by reviewing old-school records, noting absences that had been excused with minimal explanation and letters from administrators that were curiously incomplete. She called on past teachers and neighbors, weaving together pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet have a clear picture. Their stories were inconsistent, but one theme emerged. Mara had been withdrawn suddenly, her family giving a series of changing accounts about where she was or what she was doing. The social worker sensed a pattern, the subtle fingerprints of a household that had carefully concealed something for years, and her instincts told her that the truth lay behind closed doors, hidden in plain sight. When she finally visited the farmhouse, the first impression was one of meticulous normalcy, the kind that demanded casual observation rather than suspicion. The exterior was well kept, the windows shuttered in the expected way, the yard cleared and orderly. But the social worker noticed the nuances, the subtle signs of restriction, the absence of movement on the upper floor, the faint sound of muffled activity that did not belong to the routines of daily life. She paid attention to the expressions of the family members, their guarded responses, and the way their eyes flicked nervously whenever Mara's name was mentioned. Each observation confirmed what she already suspected. There was a story behind the walls of this house that had not been told, and it was her responsibility to uncover it. Her investigation became methodical, almost surgical. She asked questions that seemed mundane, observing reactions, recording small details, and looking for inconsistencies that could lead her closer to the truth. She began piecing together a timeline of Mara's disappearance, cross-referencing statements, dates, and local records. It was slow work, filled with the frustration of hitting walls both literal and figurative, yet with each small revelation, the pattern of isolation and control became clearer. Even as Mara lived her days under the watchful eyes of her family, a shadow of hope emerged. Someone outside the house was noticing, questioning, and searching for the girl who had been erased from the world she once knew, setting in motion forces that Mara herself could not yet see but would one day rely upon. Mara's realization that someone outside the house might help her came slowly, almost imperceptibly, born from a quiet desperation that had been growing for years. She had learned, through observation and small experiments, that subtle actions could carry meaning beyond the walls that confined her. Words spoken aloud were dangerous, notes left in obvious places were intercepted, and any attempt to signal for help openly was swiftly punished. Yet the desire to connect with the outside world persisted, a stubborn ember that refused to die despite the years of indoctrination and surveillance. Mara began to look for ways to communicate that were clever, indirect, and subtle enough to bypass her brother's scrutiny. She discovered that objects carried messages if they were moved or marked with intention. While helping her mother or someone she was told was acting in her interest, with chores like folding clothes or preparing supplies for donation, she began slipping small hints into the piles, items folded in unusual ways, corners turned at specific angles, buttons sewn loosely or missing, subtle patterns that seemed meaningless to anyone who did not know the code. It was painstaking work, each movement deliberate, each action layered with meaning. Mara imagined the person who might someday find these clues, someone patient and attentive enough to read between the lines and understand the silent call for help. The first few attempts were almost accidental, unnoticed by her brothers, and she had to learn which signals would survive scrutiny and which would be altered or discarded. A folded sleeve here, a stitch pulled there, a piece of paper tucked into a bag, each act was a test of her understanding of the household, a careful balance between communication and concealment. Over time, Mara refined the system, recognizing that the objects themselves were more effective than words. They could carry her desperation without attracting the direct attention of her captors. The rhythm of her days became a quiet game of coded signals, one that allowed her to maintain the illusion of compliance while simultaneously asserting a small degree of control over her situation. When the donated bag finally left the property, it carried more than just clothing. It carried Mara's presence, her silent voice, and a plea for recognition that she had been erased from the world outside. Somewhere along the route to the donation center, someone would notice the inconsistencies and the coded pattern, someone with the patience and perception to recognize that these were not accidental mistakes but deliberate markers. Mara understood that she was risking punishment, perhaps even discovery, yet the act of sending a signal was itself an assertion of her existence. It was proof that she was not entirely consumed by fear, that she retained a mind capable of ingenuity, a heart capable of hope, and a will that refused to surrender completely to the life her family had imposed upon her, planting the fragile but persistent seed of rescue and liberation. The moment Mara's message reached the right hands was the point at which the slow, invisible pressure that had governed her life began to crack. The coded signals she had left in the bag of donated clothes were not meant to be recognized by anyone casual or inattentive. They required a mind trained to notice inconsistencies, a patience to observe subtle patterns, and a determination to uncover hidden truths. When the donation center worker noticed the unusual folds, the deliberate stitching, and the way certain items had been placed, a spark of suspicion ignited. It was a small spark, almost insignificant to someone else, but enough to set in motion the machinery of an investigation that had waited years to be activated. Reports were filed quietly at first, mundane paperwork that hinted at a possible anomaly, but once they reached the right authorities, the urgency grew exponentially. The investigators approached the case cautiously, aware of the sensitivity and the possibility of false leads. They began by cross-referencing Mara's previous records, piecing together timelines that had long been ignored or dismissed. Each discrepancy, each gap in the official paperwork, now took on new significance. The coded messages were analyzed repeatedly, each detail scrutinized for its meaning and implications. To anyone else, they might have seemed like random quirks in a pile of donated items, but to trained eyes, they revealed a pattern that suggested a child had been isolated, coerced, and carefully monitored for years. The realization was chilling. Someone had been living in captivity under the guise of family life, and the signals Mara had risked so much to send had become the lifeline that could pull her out. As the investigation deepened, authorities reached out to neighbors, former teachers, and anyone who might have witnessed anomalies over the years. Stories once dismissed as oddities, the shuttered windows, the quiet upper floor, the fleeting shadows at dusk, were now re-examined with new urgency. Every seemingly minor detail became a thread in a larger tapestry of hidden control and abuse. It became clear that Mara's existence had been systematically erased from public view, that her family had constructed a world designed to prevent her voice from reaching anyone outside. The pressure on the farmhouse intensified as investigators worked discreetly, preparing for confirmation of the girl's presence. Surveillance and background checks began to outline the family's routines, identifying patterns of movement, periods of absence, and potential points of entry. Meanwhile, Mara continued to live under the watchful eyes of her captors, unaware that her small acts of ingenuity had already set the gears of rescue in motion. The tension built quietly but inexorably, a coiled anticipation of confrontation and liberation that loomed closer with each passing day, bringing the possibility of discovery, confrontation, and the long-denied promise of freedom within reach. The night of the raid arrived with a tension that seemed to thrum through the air itself, the kind of quiet that makes every creak and whistle of wind feel amplified. Investigators had spent weeks preparing, mapping the farmhouse and its surrounding grounds, noting the patterns of the family's movements, and coordinating with local authorities to ensure precision. Every detail mattered, from the timing of the father's routine to the subtle positions of doors and windows that had once seemed insignificant. The goal was clear: to reach Mara without alerting her captors prematurely, to uncover the full extent of the confinement, and to finally bring her out into the world she had been denied. As the search teams approached the farmhouse, the building loomed like a silent sentinel over the fields. Its shutters, once impenetrable barriers, now felt fragile under the scrutiny of trained eyes. The wind carried an eerie stillness, almost as if nature itself had paused to witness the confrontation. Inside, Mara was unaware that the moment she had hoped for had arrived. She moved quietly through her room, performing the rituals her family had drilled into her, the daily motions that had become both habit and survival mechanism. The subtle tension that had always lived in the corners of the house, the pressure of invisible eyes, suddenly felt different, almost anticipatory, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When the authorities entered, they did so with deliberate care. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the spaces that had been transformed into instruments of control. Locked doors, reinforced windows, and cleverly hidden rooms that Mara had navigated for years were catalogued, documented, and breached with precision. The sound of their movements echoed through the house, muted but deliberate, signaling the shift from secrecy to exposure. Mara, startled but sensing a change in the usual rhythm, froze in place. The presence of strangers, purposeful and coordinated, brought a mixture of fear and hope she had not allowed herself to feel for years. The investigators moved methodically, checking each floor and hallway, following the careful mapping they had prepared. As they reached the upper level where Mara had spent so much of her life, the reality of what they found began to emerge. The rooms were more than locked spaces, they were the physical manifestations of control, fear, and isolation. Hidden compartments, reinforced doors, and subtle barriers that Mara had adapted to over the years were now laid bare for the first time. Her existence, long confined and nearly erased from the world, was finally visible, acknowledged, and understood. When Mara was reached, the first moments were a delicate balance of reassurance and control. Gentle words replaced the harsh commands she had known all her life. Hands that did not restrict but guided allowed her to navigate the spaces she had been trapped in, and the heavy weight that had pressed on her chest for years began to lift, replaced by the dawning understanding that she was no longer alone, and that the world she had imagined beyond the farmhouse had finally arrived at her doorstep.